Now today we're going to take a look at the gradient property, and let's take a look at how it works when it comes to a linear gradient, and then we'll maybe touch base a little bit on radial gradients as well. All right, so here if we take a look at our page, I'm going to start the gradient items just right under this CSS code or the comment. All I've really done is created a basic div in the HTML that just has a standard box. Now, normally you want to have multiple properties when it comes to gradients, simply because not every browser supports it. And in fact, because of this reason, you actually have to write multiple lines of code and also have a backup version. So for browsers that do not support it, you just put in your standard background, whether that's red, green, yellow, blue, doesn't really matter. Now, for other browsers, what you typically will do is do something along these lines. So here's our standard syntax, okay? We have background linear gradient, and all we need to do is type in red. We add a comma from what color to the next color. So in this case, we'll do red to yellow, and you can see it's a top-down approach. So that's how it does the filling. Now you can change this, which I'll show you here in a minute. But first thing that's important to understand is that for other browsers, for example, for Safari 5.1 to 6, you'll want to use this syntax right here, the WebKit. Then you also have the Opera, some of the other versions right there with that hyphen, O, hyphen, linear gradient, and then again, red to yellow. And then the Mozilla Firefox, again, you'll want to use that syntax. So in theory, just to put on a gradient, you need 4 background elements and 4 background properties to hit all the browsers. But in reality, you need 5 to be able to substitute this backup. So just to have a background, you almost need 5 lines of code. And whatever line of code that you're working on, let's say even though I'm testing my browser in Chrome, which will be fine for the standard syntax, because I could go right here from green to, let's say, blue, and I go ahead and hit refresh. Let's just take a look. Okay, and green, green, green. We'll go blue, 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 refresh, and let's just see. And there you go. So you can see this tends to work out just fine for me without a problem. And I'm not sure which one it's hitting. I believe it's hitting this background gradient, green to blue. But in all else, let's put these at the very top and put the standard one there. Let's just double check. Pink to blue, there we go. Yeah, so the standard syntax I put at the bottom, so that way it takes precedence of what's going to happen. Anyway, so what you want to do is you always have these versions and variations just in case the browser doesn't support the gradients. Now, all the changes that I'm going to be playing with right here, you can also make within all these other versions, but I'm not going to make changes to all 3 of them. But in either case, what you want to do is, let's just say you want to fade it from one color to the next. What I could actually do is include RGBA values. And these typically use RGBA or RGB values. So instead of pink to green or pink to blue, I could type in something like RGB and then put in my value. And let's just say I want it to go to like a greener tone or greener color. So I'll go ahead and do this. And I'll pop that in there right there. So you can see I have multiple parentheses right there. I'm not sure if it'll need the alpha as well, but let's just take a quick look. So you can see, no, it does not. So you can see I'm creating a nice little yellow to green fade right there, which is really good for buttons and things like that. So this is a top-down approach, but you could also do the gradient from left to right. Now again, one point to keep in mind, if you wanted to make sure this was done also on Safari and Opera and Firefox, you'd have to copy this same exact code pretty much and just replace these right here at the endings, okay? Just so that way it's targeted all the different browsers. Now the other thing to keep in mind when it comes to gradients is that you could actually include multiple colors. So if I wanted to fade to this kind of green, I could include a 3rd value, and it depends if I want it more in the middle or at the bottom. So I'm just going to go ahead and at the bottom since it's a little darker. And now you can see it's creating that effect right there. And again, it's going top to bottom. If I wanted to go from left to right, then at the beginning, what I could do is go to left, add a comma, and you can see it's going left to right. If I wanted to go to To right, you can see I switched it that way. To down, let's just see if that one works. Nope. It will be to bottom. Okay, let's see. There we go, to bottom and to top. Let's just see if the top one works. Yep. So there you go. Those are the variations. Now, the other way you could do it is you could do it at an angle or a degree. So if I go, let's say 35 and I do DEG, so you can see it's at a 35 degree, or I could do, let's say 175 degrees. So you can see it kind of makes that change. How about 275 degrees? So again, you're making these changes, 225. So you can see how it's moving along those premises. The other thing that you can do is also do something along the lines of where it starts from. So you can define how far down it goes on the gradient. So let's say I have this one, and let's just remove this degree, because you could also do it with degrees, but to illustrate the example so you're not too confused, let's just go back to 2 of these. So I'll go from a lighter color to a darker color. So there's kind of our gradient right there. So what I could also include here is a starting point. And in this case, what I'm going to do is say 20%. And you can see it starts now. It goes up to the 20%, and then the next color goes. If I do 50%, you can see it goes up to that halfway mark. If I do 70%, you can see it goes right there. 70% of it is that yellow color. And then the other way I could add in is this second color. If I want a split without the gradient, I could do this at a 30%. And you can see it kind of creates a nice little box effect or button effect, which is also another way to that people go ahead and add like a little bottom button there on the rollover or something along those lines. So you could do something like that where you're creating, or even let's just say 8%, like a nice little fade. Maybe you won't be able to see it. So let's go 80% right there, and maybe 5%. Anyways, there's better ways to do that, but I think you get the idea of how this ultimately works out with the percentages right there and creating like a little fade there that creates that gradient. So anyways, that's how you do it. That's how you create gradients. As far as radial gradients are concerned, you have to remember that radial gradients start from the center and work their way out. So if I go ahead and make the change here, instead of a linear gradient, I change it to a radial gradient. You can see right there what it does. Now let me get rid of this 80% right here. And you can see there's kind of our radial gradient. It looks really nice, you know. So again, the concepts are very similar to that of a linear gradient. It's just it starts from the center and works its way out as far as the radial gradient is concerned. Now, there's one other thing you could do with a radial gradient, and that is setting the shape. So right now you can see it is kind of like an ellipse or an oval. But if I change this to a circle right here, let's just see, there you go. So you can see it's now more circular in motion or circular in shape. But if I get rid of it, it's the standard ellipse version, okay? And you'd probably be able to see that better if this was a box. So let me define the width and the height. Let's just say 300 pixels, okay? So there you go. So you can see there's our circle, and if I do get rid of it, and there's kind of our ellipse. So that's another thing that you can do with these gradients. And the other thing that you can do is also set the opacity. So just like we have this RGB value, if you add in an A and an alpha code right there, I could go ahead and say, okay, this is a 1, and we start with this is a 0. So you could actually fade and blend it based on opacity. So let's just take a look at the body. Make the body background, we'll make it pink, and see how that turns out. And you can see how it's actually on the inside of that, it's actually pink because it's actually partly transparent. So that's kind of another nifty thing that you can do with gradients. And finally, one last one is, let's just take a look here and see if this works. I'm not very familiar with it, but the repeating gradient value. All right, so what I've done here is I have the repeating gradient, and then what I've created is I've done 10% and 15% on this. And you could go to, let's say, 25% and 20%. And you can see what the gradient ultimately does is it starts this repeat factor of these shapes. Okay, so we do like a repeat of that gradient time and time again, and creates this spiral effect. Not that I think you would want to use it. Normally you'd probably stick to the linear gradient or even the radial gradient, but you can see all these different variations that you could do to create buttons. Ultimately, for me personally, I either stick to that radiant or the linear, or most of the time even the linear gradient for some buttons, because you can create some really great things and great variations when it comes to these gradients. Just looking at a nice soft little subtle fade from one color to the next. Hey, thanks so much for joining me. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button right over here if you want to make sure you're notified as I release new training videos, or if you want to get on my newsletter list by clicking this button right here. You'll get access to